Hold on,
And
hold
we
on,
are
hold on.
live. Normally, I
Yeah, we're
like to
live.
open these things on
And
the
I haven't
yes.
even picked
Normally,
the profile pic because I'm too slow myself.
exactly.
Oh, there it is.
Normally, there he
There
is.
it
Okay,
is.
perfect.
I found my pic.
Okay,
I
so
just need
normally,
to place it. It should be
I like
perfect
to.
for the occasion. So yeah.
Okay, a good old boy. A good old boy. Yeah. Um,
Whoa, dude,
X,
this is
Y, and
good.
Z top guy. Yeah. So, anyways, normally I like to open these things on a hot mic. Couldn't do this time because a man still had to find the correct Sam Hyde picture to represent himself by. Uh, anyway, so it's a bit of an unplanned stream. I have been off YouTube for almost over a year now. Did one short Prussia stream in between. Mostly because of just how busy I was with basically settling into work life, setting up a social life, which I haven't had for I haven't had a proper one ever since I basically started this YouTube channel during COVID. So a lot of just like rearranging things, I guess. And yeah, but I hope that going into the future, I will be able to do more YouTube again. I was actually not lazy during this time. I was working on a script. I think I already mentioned this in the Prussia stream, and it's still going on a script on entropy, and it's still not finished after a full year. It's 50
Yeah,
pages,
I've read
and
his
the
script. I've read it,
yeah,
and he's still. I
yeah,
mean, I kicked his ass, but he's too
the
lazy. He's
language,
too much of a fat uh, prick.
fat slob.
I don't know. Fat
Yeah,
slob.
yeah. So the thing is, 50 pages video at this point would be 4 hours. So I would probably, or the expected length would be 4 hours. So I would probably do like split it into four 1 hour videos, and but I will
Mm.
only start them once I have the
Do I
complete
have to be there for
script
all
done.
the 4 hours? Like I'm saying, because
Uh,
tomorrow I want to go to church. I
no,
have
this
to.
is this one is just 3 hours. Don't worry about it.
Oh, okay,
This stream
that's
is just three
better.
hours.
That's
Yeah,
slightly better. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And you have to be there for all of it. I will force you physically. Um,
Oh man.
Anyways,
Well,
so
and he needs me. He needs me. I'm a top guy. Of course, I'm
yeah,
gonna
you're
stay.
ST's top guy. Of
I'm
course,
a
you're going to
top
say
guy.
perfect. So,
Yes.
anyways, the reason I do this stream is because of more or less multiple things that sort of coalesce to my personal life. So, on the one hand, there of course is the online drama I privy to, because of course the online world, cyberspace is nothing but a giant embassy for the United States. That there's currently a bill in processing in the United States that would forbid United States citizens from basically uttering one of the three parties of who killed Christ. And that party is, of course, the party who general criticism of them can get you banned, removed from your job and other things. And those, of course, not being the Romans. So I don't know how self-censoring we will be during this stream, but I think most people do know which party that is. Otherwise, they're often called the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. That should be enough. Um, so that was only one of the things. Then the second one was a very good talk I recently had with a friend it was mostly about political theology, actually. And he's sort of an expert on Carl Schmitt. And I kind of discussed with him ideas I have about the prevalence of human sacrifice in every social and political culture. And I actually do have because of course this is something we carry from, let's say, 19th century cultural chauvinism, is that human sacrifice is something like one of the hardest dividing lines between what we would call a civilized and an uncivilized state. And I would actually say that any sort of civilization, because I do agree with the basic tenets of political theology that politics is basically just a sort of like negative imprint of theological structures, and then to understand any sort of polity you need to understand how it sort of developed out of its theology during both a, let's say, overprinting or typology of the theological circumstances which the people are in, and also sort of like negative reversing dialectic towards those circumstances. So basically, it's both we do things in politics exactly how we do them in our faith, and it's also we do things in politics because we can do them here but not in our faith. And that is basically how political structures develop. And if you kind of look into the rise and fall of different civilizations and different cultures all around the world, you see that they're actually always just sort of like lagging behind their own theological developments. So during all of this, I am of the opinion that the perfection of religion always needs the element of human sacrifice. And that there is no religion and no religious, especially, there's no religious concept at large, which doesn't have space for human sacrifice. And I think that there's actually a sort of dangerous misunderstanding of our own faith. And of course, there have been many misunderstandings of our own faiths, especially in the 18th and 19th century, which leads to a sort of kitschification of Christianity, which tries to sort of do these like secular humanist delineations for our religion to other religions, where we say, oh, we are different from Mayan religion, not because Mayans worship different gods, but we're different from Mayan religions because they do human sacrifice, which is uncivilized, which is not becoming of us who are civilized and just worship in churches. So that is the second thing. Yeah.
Does that go along with like the removal of the death penalty in like the polity? I mean, if we want to draw like a comparison, like the
we will get to that.
Spiritual dimension and the political.
We will get to that. We will get to all sorts of things. Right. So anyway, so we were in political legislation which forbids you from calling a certain group the killers of Christ, which means of course the killers of God. Then sort of like discussions about how present human sacrifices in, let's say, the necessity of civilization. And finally, I had a sort of like just a lot of room, I guess, to talk about ideas of, or when I talked about these things, there were a lot of people who kind of like denied how agency and responsibility works in groups. So when I talked about these topics on a basic level with people on Twitter, I guess you can't really call it talking. There were a lot of people who, especially with the group who killed God, wanted to sort of advocate for them not having collective responsibility because there was actually only a small vocal minority who basically got who got Christ killed, right? And so why can we justify judging these people over what is only a small minority? And this, I kind of looked into the profiles of the people who were upvoting that kind of reasoning, and they were all this sort of like sovereign citizen types, right? So a lot of Gadsden flags, a lot of like, my liberty, like liberty is or death kind of stuff, right? And this is a fundamentally American error to make. And it's starting to be, because of the American influence over the world, starting to be a fundamental Western error to make, because of course Germany, our country, is very, very heavily American influenced, and sort of like because Germany, the country we live in now, is younger than America, right? It's a sort of like a derivative state, especially culturally, of America. So that is something that we now also have in our culture, and it is very corrosive and it's very dangerous to cultural understanding at large. And the only alternative that is generally seen to it is a sort of like Chinese and Japanese style collectivism. And then I actually also, and this is the final thing I will kind of like want to open with, when kind of like going into, I think I want to do something on DEICIDE, I rediscovered a video I meant to watch quite a while ago. It was a very good video. It's titled something like, "Why do you always kill gods in Japanese video games?" Right? And
I've watched this. Well,
have you seen that? Have you seen it?
Quite nice. Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, and of course, as I have maybe mentioned in the last stream I did, since I basically went offline, is since a bit more than a year now, I have been working actually what the guy is talking about as like the big evil force, because I'm not agreeing with it 100%. The background stuff is good on like the history of Japan and China, and we will get into a little bit of that also, because people often forget that we do have paganism nowadays. We have active pagan countries, India, Japan, and we do, but what he kind of like makes out to be the big enemy or the big reason is basically just capitalism. And I always hate explanations which fall back on capitalism, because capitalism is a non-entity. Capitalism doesn't describe anything.
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
It can mean anything. And so it doesn't really give us any insight. And what he describes as what capitalism is to him are the Japanese mega corporations. They do have a name, I've forgotten it at the moment. But the problem with that is that even though there's a lot of truth in his critique, it actually is sort of insufficient, because it also doesn't understand why and how people basically ritually do what they do. Because he correctly understands that this, to the Japanese, is a quasi-religious dilemma. But he doesn't understand religiosity, because he himself isn't religious, right? Because he's one of those people who just kind of see religiosity as something which people need, instead of God as something which people need, right? Because there's a fundamentally different. So for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, we need religiosity, we need like spirituality, right? We need to believe in something, instead of saying, oh, we need God. And that is basically what religiosity and spirituality and so on and so forth kind of like develops out of. Okay, so with all of this out of the way, the fundamental question the stream is about is, who killed God, right? And of course, this is assuming that everybody watching this knows that God. Exactly, that's part of what we also want to talk it. But we generally accept already that Christ is God. So this is not a question of who is God; it's who killed God. And of course, to ask who killed God, we can kind of go to Nietzsche and say, did we kill God even in the 19th century, right? But more fundamentally, I want to look at specifically the killing of Christ, because of course we do have a notion of us having slain God at some point, and we do have very much the physicum of having slain God 2025. Right? It's actually like 1909 1991 years
70?
ago, is it? It's 33 AD, right? So
yeah, it is.
1991 years, if my math checks out.
Oh yeah, right. I forgot to add the 20s to the 2000.
Yeah. We're not living in the year 2000, my friend.
Oh man, it's
so
over.
it's so over. Yeah, can't play. I don't know what was in the 2000s. I was barely alive.
GameCube.
GameCube. Oh no. Anyway, so there's of course, and with the discourse. So basically, for those who don't know what happened, is the U.S. Did like new anti-Semitism laws, because too many people have been criticizing Israel, and that's verboten in the United States. And as part of those anti-Semitism laws, you can't say that the people have killed Christ. And this led into a massive derivative argument on Catholic Twitter, basically, if the people killed Christ. And so the very first answer that a lot of, I'm too smart for you kind of people gave, is the completely correct answer, which is also completely irrelevant to the discussion they were having, and also completely in need of depth. And that answer is, yeah, you can say it.
Oh, it's they did, but so did everyone else.
It is, right? I killed Christ with my sins. I killed Christ with my sins. I am the one who's culpable, which is completely correct, which is kind of like the mystical answer, right? That is the final answer you get to. But with many like of the final answers, it's like telling
You're
people
missing the
when they are
question. It's like 42.
Yeah.
And what's the question?
it's not just that. It's not, yeah, that's like a way to put it. Like it's just like giving the solution without like explaining it. It's just saying it's 42. And the other thing is that it's basically like saying to someone who asks about like dating advice to just say, just be yourself. Right?
Yeah,
Just be
exactly.
yourself is the thing,
Just be
is the
yourself.
final message, right? Like after you've understood what dating is and what to expect and what to watch for and everything and so on and so forth, only once you have all of that context, you can then say be yourself, right? Because only then do you understand what those words
Yeah,
mean.
once you stop being
And if
like
we
garbage,
can't
maybe.
talk about the Romans, which we of course still can talk about because, well, there's no Italian IPAC, and the other people, can we understand what it even means for us to have killed God? And so this is a lot of what we want to talk about. What does it mean for a pagan to kill God, which is kind of like the Romans who were basically rewarded for it, right? And what does it mean for someone who is elected by God to kill him? What that ultimately means for us to kill God, because there's sort of like both the pagan and the elect in us, right? What it even means to be elect in a Christian setting, because that is something that actually sort of swapped or that is very much misunderstood nowadays, and so on and so forth. So the first question I want to get into here, however, is why is it bad to kill people?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you can take like this Aristotelian view and say there's like natural law and like teleology, and basically humans are set up in a certain way where certain actions are in line with their nature, and they are a zoon politikon, thus they are social, and killing goes against sociality, and therefore it goes against who they are, therefore it's bad. Or you can have like a divine command approach, just say, well, I point to 10 commandments, it is on this list, and by this decree it is immoral because there is law that is objectively given to man.
I think that's like the early two answers, right? The one is like something like natural law, human instinct, right? We know it's not right to kill someone, right? We just kind of know it. That's why we don't do it. And the other one is basically because God said so.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem with this, so the first answer is kind of it's too weak. Natural law in itself generally is too weak. And by the way, if you go through Aristotelian natural law, you actually can kill people, and there's actually a lot of exceptions as to why you can kill people.
Of course,
right?
there are.
If it's interest of the
but
state,
there are
if it's
exceptions
interest, yeah,
in reality as well. I mean,
yeah, of course. But to the more like fundamental question, like it doesn't really give an answer. And then because God said so, again, this is kind of a point where you kind of like have the conclusion at the end, which is like, yeah, that's a correct answer, but it sort of lacks a certain amount of depth to it, right? Because again, it is correct, but why even, right? Because we have to think about, we believe in a perfect afterlife, right? Now, we don't believe that the afterlife is necessarily good for us, because we say, well, some people go to hell. So we can't do what sort of like Gnostic sects do, where they basically say, oh, the spiritual realm is the only place to be. So kill yourself and basically like cheat yourself through like the mundanity of life, right? And there's actually, like, for example, Buddhism and other like Gnostic directions sometimes even have to make up like special rules as to why the best, most pious thing isn't suicide. And of course, things like Jonestown, right? Like a lot of like ritual and cultural things do kind of have this idea of just killing yourself to get to an afterlife, right? Sort of like shortcut it.
Cool.
And there's the Kool-Aid, exactly. And there's kind of like you have to almost make up a religious cope so your religion doesn't devolve into like a suicide command, right? So but after all, we do believe in an afterlife, and we do believe that God is a perfect judge. So in the end, sort of like the thing we say, if we just say, well, God says don't do it, right, is that the person who murders someone else takes up some guilt at the moment just by fiat, right? Because God says so. The person who is murdered actually doesn't, right? It shouldn't
Yes.
it shouldn't in any shape or form kind of like go into the question whether they go to heaven or hell when they get murdered. So actually, there's no drawback in a sense to being killed. There's just a
Yeah, but
drawback to killing.
of course, but I mean, if you look at it from a practical point of view, assuming there's like limited time to repent, and most people haven't repented, like if you just kill a random person on the street, there's a good chance that if you hadn't killed them, it might have really affected their final destination.
This is getting into the correct direction. So what is death? Right? What is death to us? And so a lot of people know that death is important, right? Most people, I think, don't know how important death actually is. They don't know what like the place that death has to have in life, and that is mostly because contemporary society tries to remove death from life. And one of the
Yes,
reasons why we are a dying society is because we try to remove death, right? So death. So ultimately, humanity, we need finality, and death is the ultimate finality, right?
very Heideggerian.
But the problem with Heidegger is that Heidegger believes that we need to sort of face death and then find something which is worth dying for. And only that way can we achieve true being and live what he calls authentically,
Yeah.
which is sort of like the Heideggerian version of achieving spiritual fulfillment or theosis, right?
Yes, of course.
It sort of describes correct things, but I would say that he especially makes one crucial mistake, and that is we don't actually want to have something to live for. We just want to have something which is more beautiful to us than death, because humans desire to die.
Well, and we get the,
This is something
add Freud
I
into the mix, and we can
no.
no
So
not yet.
yeah, let me try to explain this. And this also kind of goes into the dilemma of why is killing bad, and also why isn't it bad, right? So what people do, right, when they kill themselves, it's not really that they have nothing to live for. It's that they just cut to the chase. They just it's a pseudo rational choice, right? You kill yourself because that way you achieve finality. Now again, we pursue finalities, right?
Yes.
And these finalities only ever, or they only ever change, let's say, in a way, through, of course, the pursuit. So there's a sort of like hermeneutic exchange between the goal which we have, and the road which we take towards it. But
Yes.
ultimately, we always want to get to the end.
Yes.
And so the
And that
reason
is
why I
also
say
why,
that we,
in
yeah,
my personal life, I had reflected once if there ever could be a cause for me to kill myself, what it would be, and it would just be to have certainty. That was what I thought, and that maps onto that. You know, just having, because once you're dead, you're dead. You have like a certain knowledge of some kind, right, behind the veil.
exactly. Exactly. And that is the thing, right? We pursue after God. God is the absolute finality. Death is also the absolute finality. We instinctively must put together in our brains that God and death are heavily related. Because they are basically both, in a sense, the absolute finality, which is why you can't actually have a proper relationship to God without a proper relationship to death, which to many atheists looks like people who believe are just afraid of death and basically make something up about death, because an atheist usually projects his own fear of death, which is his fear of God, onto a believer, and believes that the believer has just found a different way of coping with death. Right? And so the reason I'm talking about this is you really, and of course I always recommend to people to work in a hospice. One of the main reasons that's, in my opinion, it's one of the last few acts of true charity you can do in the West, because so much charity has been basically institutionalized into being soulless and just mechanical. But hospice work hasn't been, because from a mechanical standpoint, hospice work is useless, because you literally can't do anything to change the situation of someone in a hospice. That's why they are in a hospice. So the only thing you're helping them with is dying. And there's many things you realize when you work in a hospice. And the very first thing any hospice worker will say to you is that it's not like a place to be an emo, basically. Like just sulk around and be sad and so on and so forth. It's actually a place where a lot of people actually start living. And that is because when you do have this recognition of death, right? And you do have this recognition of mortality, you actually only then gain the full perspective on your own life and on the meaning of your own life, right? And that is basically what you need, right, in order to live correctly. And the other thing you realize is that dying is not that which people are afraid of. What they actually are way more afraid of is leaving the affairs open, which will basically, which they basically still carry, right? So the people who there's I don't know, I can't give it percentages, but there's about, I would say, maybe 20 to 30% of people who make it good, right? When there's people who starve themselves, there's people who just completely try to some people get opioids, right? Just completely try to not face it, run away from it. But about 30% of people, I would say, make it good, right? Out of those 30%, probably 100% are religious, but 30% of people make it good. And the people who make it good always, well, not all of them, because some actually have their affairs in order, but some of them like very much just still need to get their affairs in order, say their goodbyes, right? And then there's usually a time afterwards, because you usually don't know to the day when you're going to die. And in that time, they just live. They live and they're happy and they're fun, and being around them is fun. They're great. And that is something which is very unique to a hospice. And that sort of liberation, right, is something we usually associate with something very kitsch, right, with like success and wealth and so on and so forth, or like with freedom and high ideals and everything. But it actually comes exactly, but it actually comes from death. Okay,
yeah, from
because it is the embrace of the finality. Humans need finality, and we don't so much need something to live for as we need a proper way to go into dying, right? And that is also the thing with killing. One of the things that a kill derives the other person of, which is kind of, let's say, the negative thing the other person takes, right? Because it's not the case in Christianity that you say, oh, the person who's killed, they're perfectly happy. Is one of the things you deprive the other person of is the way in which they die, right? Because they do not have the ability to sort of like live a life. Well, we of course are sort of called to live a life which could end at any moment, but you sort of like take from them the ability to live a life that has a proper end realistically, because in reality we do not live a life where we could die at any moment. And then the other point is that kind of going back to us and what we do when we kill, is that actually what we do is we take upon ourselves to deliver the other person to judgment. And we do have a typology of that, which we also find despicable, which makes things more clearly. And that is
self-righteousness.
Exactly, self-righteousness.
I mean, you
for
find
example,
the verse in the Bible that only gods can decide upon life and death, and it's exactly that.
basically. I always liken things to the schoolyard. And on the schoolyard, you will always have children which kind of like, rat other children out to a teacher, right? And they basically go, oh, X, Y did that and that, right? So they want to inflict, or they want to be the one who decides to inflict the judgment onto the teacher, onto the other child right now, right? So they don't necessarily see themselves as judges, but they do desire the other child to be judged, often because they actually do have an idea of what this judgment will be, and they want to use it to hurt, but also in an, let's say, illegitimate and cowardly way of seeing what the judgment may be. So a kid who rats another kid out might do this because they want to test the limits of the teacher, but are too much of a coward to do it themselves, right? So anyone who kills someone else, and this is kind of like the point we're getting to. This is what we're drawing from this. Anyone who kills someone else, and we're talking about not murder out of, like, let's say, lower carnal reasons. So, for example, I'm angry at the guy next door, and I just go over and punch him in the face, and this leads to something else, and I kick him to death, right? Accidentally, basically. No, it's a sort of like premeditated murder, which we very, 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 very rarely have, right? But which is sort of like what true crime is about, stuff like that. Anyone who does that basically takes a coward's approach to trying to pierce the veil between life and death. And that is sort of a coward's approach of trying to pierce the veil between man and God. And that is why it is so, so, so sacrilegious, right? Because not only is it trying to pierce the veil between yourself and God, which is, let's say, a lion's task and a sort of ultimate task, right? Which can be very, very, let's say, sanctifying, but also very hurtful on yourself, right? Or like very, very much like an act of pride. But it's also that you do not do it in the proper way of doing it basically yourself, but you're using another as sort of your scapegoat to have them sent into this veil and to hopefully try to derive something from this. Right?
We are
so that is yeah.
I'm just want to open something up. We need to talk about Cain and Abel, but especially about Cain very soon, right? Because I think
go ahead. I didn't plan on talking about Cain, but
it's the most memorable thing in the Old Testament for me, literally. And it is exactly the deprivation of any sort of finality for this poor man. Well, what you poor, I mean, he deserves it, but in a way, but else it wouldn't have happened to him. But you know, Cain kills Abel. We all know that, and then God marks Cain and sits him on a tree, and no man can hurt him without getting 7 times worse done onto him. And this that no man will touch Cain, and Cain will walk forever and ever.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, God does deprive Cain of any sort of finality because he sends off the generations of Cain to always be in conflict.
Union of like mercy and justice, because he punishes him by sparing him, and this is so like awe-inspiring,
poetic.
I think, that he gets punished by being spared.
Okay, so this is a sort of preamble on killing people. So, of course, the next thing is that we're not just talking about a man who was slain. Where we are talking about, in a sense, a man who was slain, because in a final sense, you can't kill God, right? It's of course, let's say, logically impossible to kill something which is the basis for being itself. It's like tearing apart the fabric of the universe, right? Something that, of course, can't actually be torn apart, no matter how many memes you make about that. And because there would be no medium in which that could happen, right? So the question is, the next question I want to put is, and you have seen the killing gods in Japanese video games thing, is what does it mean for us to kill a god, right? Because that is so important to understand this issue. And I want to talk about both things, both what does it mean for a Christian to kill God, and what does it mean for a pagan to kill God? Because the people we have basically at Christ's crucifixion are the pagans who do the physical deed, the lower part of it, and then let's say the people who were supposed to be the proto-Christians
The Israelites.
doing the higher deed. But this is like, because of course they are supposed to be the Christians, right? They are
Yes.
supposed to be Christians. They are supposed to receive Christ as their Messiah, but they instead do the higher part of the deed. So where they do not physically kill him, they are the ones who accuse him. And it is very clear that the dynamism between Rome and the Israelites and the authorities, the rabbinical authorities, it's now someone would say, oh, rabbinical practices have only been come into play after Christ or Christianity,
We can just call it
and so on and so forth.
Pharisaic authority if we want.
Well, it's not the Pharisees either, because there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I will call them the rabbinical authorities, because rabbi just means teacher, and it's basically so Israel as the chosen people since Moses, basically. Well, technically since Melchizedek, but let's see if we get into that. Since Moses, are people who are subject to their rabbis. Right? The Mosaic judges are rabbis. Moses is a rabbi. The prophets are rabbis, right? The great prophets. The smaller prophets are also rabbis, but they're just not listened to. So it is a people led by their rabbis, and it is by their teachers, and it's the rabbis who accuse Christ. Right? Anyways, the question or the thing is or these people are supposed to be again the first Christians, and they take the higher order, the kind of the brain part, right? They are the brain who says kill the man. The Romans are the hand who actually kills him, right? Who
Yes.
physically kills him. So if we say as Christians, Go ahead.
It's like the non-believer or the pagan or whatever, like the bad person is still an instrument of the divine, and in the same relation we can say that these Romans are instruments of these wicked rabbinicals. In a certain
Yes,
sense.
but there is a sort of like cross-roaded fate here, because the Romans, again, we only have one Roman. Well, we have two Romans really, who are really
Pilate.
shown. Pilate and
the man with the spear,
Longinus. Yeah,
who repents
with the long spear, Longinus.
Thank
Exactly.
God.
So Pilate is a bit of a shaky figure, but Longinus, who kind of takes up the role of the Romans par excellence, actually gets elevated by killing Christ, by physically, because Pilate, of course, also is just he's not actually physically involved in the act. Longinus is physically involved in the killing of Christ, and he actually gets elevated through this. This is very important when we talk about the Israelites in a second, or well later on, right? Is that the physical piercing of Christ, the spear, and later with the fingers of doubting Thomas, actually elevates them and doesn't condemn them, right? So before we go to the pagans, let's quickly go to the Israelites. And the Israelites, of course, they're supposed to be Christians. What does it mean for a Christian to kill God?
Yeah, it means to lose his status, right? I mean,
To lose his
because
status.
the Christian is, I think, that's what I'm thinking while you are describing Longinus. the pagan has to get close to God to kill God, whereas the Pharisees are basically removing God. Not the Pharisees, the rabbinical people, whatever kind, are removing God from themselves in the act of issuing him death. So it's like one party has to get close to God to kill him, and thus they are elevated. The other party has to detach themselves.
That's a
This is
beautiful way of putting it. Actually, that's a beautiful way of putting it.
You're welcome.
I would phrase it, or I had intended to phrase it a little different. Actually, now you put it that way, I might put it that way as well in the future. But for a Christian, very first thing, to kill God means to kill God in our hearts, right? It means that we have a relationship with God that surpasses the intellectual, right? And kills him in the deepest being of our being. Because, and this is very important, we are not meant to be intellectual creatures. The faith is not meant to be an intellectual piece of knowledge, right? It is not meant to be a form of gnosis or a form of school, right? So to be Christian is not to understand theology. It is not to understand certain theological aspects or stuff like that. It is to have a relationship with Christ in the heart, to have him occupy our soul, right? That is what it means to be Christian. You can know theology, right? But you don't need to know theology, right? And this is basically what what kind of like the irony is with the Israeli people, because what happens is they are chosen as the physicum, right? They carry the physical ark of the covenant, right? So this is important because when you compare religions around the world, right, most religions have de-incarnate concepts or partially incarnate concepts in their religion. So what am I talking about? Basically, if you go into
about the poo people.
what would be your example with the Hindus?
Well, I don't know. They have like a Krishna being like an incarnation of something. I saw like a thread by Eris where he compared Eris. Do you know Eris? He's an
I don't think I
Australian
know.
great Catholic Twitter guy, and he made a thread comparing Trinity with basic in attack against Arvol, or in defense against Arvol rather, comparing the Trinity with like the Hindu triad. And I don't have the theological specifics on hand right now. Like if he was here, you probably have nice digression on that. But they have like this idea that I think Vishnu becomes Krishna or something. But they're like multiple avatars, so it's like none of this really truly
Exactly.
the thing.
So we can do it with Hinduism, we can do it with Buddhism as well. So in Buddhism, for example, the gods incarnate into different forms again and again. Right, the Dalai Lama, also a Buddhist god, it's a Buddhist deity, right? Something even beyond what a Christian would think of as an angel. It reincarnates into different forms, right? The idea is basically you either have something which is not incarnate at all, right? So you have a higher deity, something like Tengri in the Tengriist faith, the great sky, right? Where you say we cannot touch Tengri, we cannot feel him, we can only like realize his presence, but he's never really present, right? He is only able to be seen as a reflection of his own self through the way in which he acts upon the material world, right? That is one idea which is very common in many religions, right? It's kind of like the also sort of like Platonist approach to religiosity, that there's basically like a secondary spiritual world in which spiritual entities kind of reside and they affect the material world. And then the other way, or which we have very often, we have it in Hinduism, we have it in Buddhism, we have it in Taoism, for example, with Lao Tzu, is that the there is a sort of like hidden second special spiritual realm, but it temporarily can infuse itself into a vessel, and this vessel therefore then becomes an interface for us with that spiritual reality. But actually, the way it works in proto-Christianity, so in the Old Testament, is that it is even more immediate, right? So the Ark of the Covenant is not just a representative piece into which a, let's say, momentary incarnation of some divine force, power, or right is residing, but it is the very much appropriate and final resting place of this divinity, right? So there can never be, in a sense, another Ark of the Covenant, right? Which is, well, typologically untrue, because the Ark of the Covenant is actually a type of Mary, who is sort of the perfection of what the Ark was going to be. But she is more than the Ark, right? And she is not the Ark, let's say, reincarnated. She is that which the Ark was supposed to be, or which the Ark already was in some capacity, perfected in a higher capacity. So basically what this means is that the proto-Christian faith is the most materialist, whilst still is accepting a spiritual supremacy. So the spiritual is still the thing from which existence is derived, right? God is the Lord of heaven primarily, right? But the spiritual can be found completely factually, let's say, in the material realm, right? For example, in the form of the Ark of the Covenant, which is why the Ark of the Covenant actually has spiritually perfected aspects. Like, you can't touch it unless you're clean enough, because your face melts off, like in Indiana Jones. And that is kind of like the creed that the proto-Christians have, because that's only if you understand this sort of immediacy of their faith, and you understand that all the other peoples, they're not, we were trained on this idea that back in the day, or that like let's say the starting space of humanity is that there's many pagan religions, and that maybe some amongst those are Christian. If you're like very, very Christian, like, okay, there's all these pagans running around, but there's like one or two Christians after Cain and Abel, basically, right? And maybe, so for example, the idea is, well, Cain is really where all the paganism comes from, and so on and so forth. But what we need to understand, and if you study ancient religions, if you study ancient Chinese religion, if you actually study up on Proto-Indo-European religion, which is very muddled, because the scholarship onto Proto-European religion comes mostly from the 19th century, where they try to actively deny the idea of ancient monotheism because it was too Christian. And if we now look into Proto-Indo-European religion using the archaeology we have nowadays, especially the archaeology we have in China, which then again Westerners often don't want to accept, for the reason that Westerners don't want to do PIE religion in that way, and then China, because they already have graduated on PIE being pluralists, and then Chinese don't want to do, because they don't want to accept that the people who basically gave them their own religious traditions were not from China. Then you finally get to the point that the PIEs are a henotheistic religion, right? And that they do have many gods, but that they are all subject to one higher deity. So as we go into like the different the different traditions of faith, and then if you go into India in a, let's say, more honest manner, and you go into Persia and so on and so forth, you actually see that there is a remembrance for a monotheism. And we actually do have the exact, or almost what we can assume to be the exact mechanism by which polytheism exists, because we do.
This refutes this whole like modern kind of anthropological type of narrative, where we say first we have like animism, and then we have like Greek polytheism, and then monotheism is like the most scientific way you can think while still not being an atheist, and then you eventually become like an atheist. Like this kind
Yeah,
of teleological kind of like progress leap from like many to like one to none, basically.
it is basically another way of trying to sort of like de-idealize Hegel, because it's trying to take the Hegelian phenomenology of spirit and the way into which
Yeah,
he very well outlines the idea of coming into consciousness towards God through a dialectical exchange with the exterior world and person, into achieving, let's say, a higher acknowledgement for God, to saying again, well, there is no God, but people need spirituality. So what actually happens is that you have a more refined spirituality, and then you have a refinement process from low poly, localized, animistic spirituality into perfected. And the funny thing, of course, is that these arguments were actually made for absolutism, and the finalization of that is the Meiji Restoration, which of course led into the Japanese Empire, which people nowadays, especially the people who kind of like try to rest on this sort of historiography, really don't want to be the kind of people who say, "Oh, the Japanese Empire is actually sort of the perfection of human statecraft." But anyways, what we
neoliberalism has been tried once, and it was failed.
yeah. So, but the point we're getting to is that the ancient Israelites, the proto-Christians, they are elect because they're not the, let's say, highest, but in a sense, they're the lowest of the people, right? Where the other faiths are way more abstract, right? And way more willing to go towards abstraction. The Israelites are way more down to the ground, basically. And then at the same time, this actually allows them to inverse the religious tendencies of their time. So, of course, if we look at ancient Israel, let's say immediately after Exodus, and this is in the Bronze Age, right? And we look at Bronze Age civilizations around them, the way religiosity works is, and you probably haven't seen my video on the mapping of heaven because it's banned in Germany because I use Akira clips, and apparently the GEMA is very upset about that, and I still haven't
Can't you
uploaded
edit them somehow? That they
I can edit them. I can edit them, but I was always too lazy to do it, and just too salty at the GEMA.
We'll see what happens if I
Yeah.
get reminded to do so.
Yeah. So, anyways, but in that I speak a lot about the function of an egregore. But because you haven't seen it, because a lot of people might be new and haven't heard about it, or might be Germans and don't have access to that video, I will try to explain it in a short sense, and then we understand why they are important for religiosity in a second. An egregore is basically that entity which comes into being when we are social. So people are social always with a sort of expectation of a gain. This gain doesn't necessarily need to be a material gain. So I don't necessarily join a group of other people because I want, I don't know, that they all have Game Boys and I also want a Game Boy, right? But there's always a gain, and the gain can be kind of like the social interaction itself. So I can join a group of people just because I want a social interaction, right? But for example, I can also join a chess club because I want to play chess, right? Then there is something within chess which I sort of desire, admire, or want to be part of, or want to be part of me. And for that reason, I basically go into the chess club, right? And then our collective pursuit of that thing which we all desire, want to be part of, or want to be part of us, gives the group a special character, a special dynamism. This sort of dynamism is what basically makes up the essence of the group. This essence can become self-perpetuating. And if this essence does become self-perpetuating, then we speak of what is essentially a living entity. And this living entity is what we call in this channel, egregore. Okay? So the egregore is basically the intersocial being that arises when we socialize. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
And
makes sense.
egregores play a huge part in our religiosity. Right? The church does have an egregore, and the egregore is not the Holy Spirit. Right? The Holy Spirit
What's the
is that which
mystical
should.
body? Isn't it the mystical
It's,
body of Christ?
no.
Oh, okay.
Because the egregore is that which can be manipulated by people. So that's why I say it's not the mystical body and it's not the Holy Spirit, right? Because it is more like you have
It's more like Vatican
gut bacteria. You have gut bacteria in your body, right?
Yes.
Which is another sort of living being which should work for you, right? Sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time, for most people, it does, right? The egregore of the church is similar to that. It is a sort of animal. Egregores are not like humans; they're subhuman, which is very important. That means that that which the group is in itself is of a lower rank of being than the members which make it up, right? Which is very, very important to understand how this works, right? It's also actually in the sort of roles which men and women take when they approach a group setting, is that men kind of like factor into above the egregore and women below it, right? And it's actually, we can say, this is a similar response as to how people feel about certain animals, right? So if an animal threatens a man, he will be much more likely to try to dominate the animal than a woman will be. And the social animal, right, which is the thing which is in between the people, basically works the same for men and for women. So if a group, let's say, has a sort of hostility towards a person, if that person is a man, he will have a higher desire to dominate the group in some shape or form than the woman who will have a desire to either submit herself to the group or to disassociate. So the egregore is, again, is just the creature which basically comes into being, and the dynamic, and is a presence with fear. And the way in which Bronze Age religiosity works is that in the Bronze Age, basically, your egregore is your god. So if we look at the Mesopotamian deities, every city has their own deity, and the deities are ranked against one another. And depending on how powerful the city is, so powerful is the deity. And only then do we understand why Babylon is so often mentioned in the Old Testament, because Babylon is basically the most powerful city which dominates all the other cities. So in the ranking of gods, which is going on continually, their god is actually just the most powerful god, right? So we have a sort of like recreation of the divine hierarchy, because of course we do have a divine hierarchy in which God is at the top, and then there's the angels and the prophets kind of like below him. And in this, we have this kind of idea of a certain ranking. And that is something which recreates itself outside, but in a sort of agnostic way, in a sort of like might makes right way, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the Christian and proto-Christian ranking is a fixed one, the contemporary Bronze Age ranking is one which is up to continuous re-examination by the means of politics, right? So this is also what we get into later when we get into Japan. So the video you saw about why Japanese video games kill God also draws attention to this point, which is one of the best points the guy in the video actually makes, is that in Japanese history, the social dynamic of Japan actually was always stronger than its religious dynamic. So basically, the social consensus dictated what and who God was. And the religious part follows. So that means that in Japan, religiosity can only really be honestly understood as something which sort of like comes out of social conscientiation, right? And
I understand that.
that is why he is very much correct in saying that killing a god in Japan must have a very deep social aspect to it, right? But I would argue, for example, that it's not the only
That
reason.
cannot universalize. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, so going back to the topic of who are the proto-Christians, they're the people who kind of immediatize God, right, into something which, on the one hand, is physically the most immediate and incarnate already amongst them, right? And of course, this is something which even like furthers itself into Christianity, where we now the most simple way to understand the Eucharist is just we eat God. And
Yeah.
they also, at the same time, are the ones who invert the idea of how divinity makes itself known, because where everyone else has basically this theology of divinity making itself known through the dialectics of human interaction, right? Cities fighting against one another. The Israelis say, even though they are one of the weakest cities, say our God is the strongest, right? So they go the other way around, where instead everyone else is basically being agnostic and saying, oh, we don't know the full truth and we will see what happens. They basically insist on a pure idealism. Our God is the strongest, which they offset by a very strong materialism in our God is also, our God is also present in the tabernacle, basically, right? Or
Yes.
yeah, well, it's not fully present, but present in a way in which there can be no other presence on this earth, basically. So that means that they actually, in a sense, because they have this physicality, they bring God into the world physically through Mary, right? She is, of course, of their tribe. She is their flesh and blood, and she brings the flesh and blood of God into the world, right? And that, of course, is the absolutely most immediate God can be. And that is sort of what they were chosen for and what they were elected for. And this makes them the eldest brothers of humanity. And there's a very important also caveat to this, because people don't understand anymore what election means in a Christian setting. And that has mostly to do with the British Empire, which sort of inverted the idea of election in a Christian setting, and then later Anglophone traditions, especially also in America, from being a greater burden into being a greater blessing. So what being of the tribe of Judah basically means is that, and Christ spells this out 100 times in the almost half of his of his symbols, or no, of his, what do you call them? The stories he tells are basically about
Parables.
the fact that the parables, thank you, are about the fact that the tribe of Judah is called to do more than everyone else, right? And that they have to accept this calling without thinking that they will get a greater reward in return, right? Because that's basically what being an elder brother is, right? If you're the eldest of brothers, and I know this because I am the eldest of brothers, then it is only natural that not only will you do more, right, because you're stronger and older, that there will be more expectation of you because you're mature, but also that onto both of these, you also carry an additional burden of being the one who is exemplary for the other brothers, right? All of these things are the calling of the people of Judah, right? And there is no real expectation of a greater return for this, just as being the eldest doesn't necessarily, depending, of course, on the culture, and doesn't necessarily go along with something like having a greater inheritance, right? It's just an expectation, and it is the expectation that is made of their tribe, and this expectation that is now made of Christians. Christians are expected to behave better than not Christians without any additional perk for this, solely by the reason that they have realized that God is God, and that they know it is better to follow him than to not do so.
Right.
Yeah.
Someone
So
has to do it. Someone has to
Yeah.
show it. Someone has to, like, no one else can.
yeah. And of course, this is a huge problem at the time, because one of the things that has already kind of like encroached itself into the rabbinical tradition is the idea that when the Messiah comes, he will dominate the world, right? Which would be kind of like the Mesopotamian way, and in that sense, the Babylonian way of thinking about religion, that he comes to dominate the world, and that he basically now puts in the Babylonian way the hierarchy of things correctly, right? So that not Rome, who is kind of like the newest big god, basically dominating everyone else, right? The same way Babylon did. That now the Messiah will basically dominate everyone else and make Jerusalem into a new Rome, the temple into a new pantheon, right? And the Jews into a new sort of like wealthy aristocracy which lords over everyone else. And that is a belief that is still very, very much active in, well, there's
Yes.
many sects of Judaism, but in
In certain
quite a few
people,
sects,
let's call
right?
them, I don't know.
Let's call them
Let's
Bionists.
call some
No,
names.
not
Some people in
to be fair.
Hollywood or in the Wall
Yeah,
Street or working in the New York Times. I
yeah.
don't know
But to
where.
be fair, not all Zionists do believe that Jews need to dominate the world. But
That is
it
true.
is actually, it's probably much. It probably has decreased much more now that Zionism is a more than just like, let's say, a fiction, right? And it actually has like a
Yeah.
concrete state attached to it. Because of course it just becomes way more realistic that is never going to work. Anyways, with this comes this idea of dominating the world, and of course there's a conflict with Christ and his a way of being the Messiah there, and there's also an inability to properly canonize the word, right? They cannot accept that God canonizes for them. They cannot accept it anymore, even though it should be self-evident from their theology as opposed to other theologies around them. And so they actually rebuke him in the least carnal way possible. They rebuke him only by their words, but not by their flesh, right? They do not hurt him. They do not harm him ever, right? But they rebuke him, they slander him, so other people harm him.
Yes.
And so, and this is very important, because when Pilate speaks to them, right, he says, his blood is on your hands. And they accept that, right, in that moment. And a lot of people think that this is them damning themselves. But this is the other way around. This is the light of hope that shines for them. If they can accept his blood on their hands, that is their way to salvation. And later we will have Peter sitting amongst a crowd
Oh,
of
yes.
people who were complicit in the killing of Christ. And he tells them, you are the ones who killed Christ. And if he hadn't done that, I'm 100% sure, if he hadn't done that, they could not be saved. And they followed him, right? They followed him, almost all of them followed him, right? He had to have told them that they were the ones who killed Christ. That his blood was not on the Romans, right? Because Christ became flesh through them, right? His death, now they have to carry before they can be relieved from it. Only if they accept this burden can they be relieved from it. If they do not accept it, they will not be relieved. But if they do accept it, they will be relieved, right? So that is the main reason why it is so important for a Christian to be able to tell a Jew that the blood of Christ is on his hands, because in the place which they take in the Bible, in the very unique place they take as the eldest brothers of humanity and as the inheritors of the physical coming into being of God, they cannot opt out through idea, language, word, opinion, right? And that is the same for us as Christians, right? We opt out the same way they do, right? We already have the immediacy of God, basically. We already have the understanding that God became man and flesh, right? So if we kill God by sin, by what we are and what we do, right? We do not do so in the way the Romans do it, who do it out of ignorance, and for whom it actually is. And we will get into that shortly. We do not do it in the way in which the Romans do it. We do it in the way in which the Jews do it, right? And so to understand that, to be able to say, his blood is on my hands, right? I am the one who killed him, which of course is what other people want to kind of like preempt this by, to, in a sense, exculpate the Jews, which thereby would damn them, because it is an exculpation which is not ours to do, which is only able to be given once someone has accepted their guilt, right? Yeah. In doing so, we have to sort of like understand the physicum of our betrayal to God. And that is why we have to be barred from the Eucharist, for example, because we cannot at that point touch him physically, because that physicum is basically not ours to be present with anymore, because otherwise we don't understand the damage we have done. Okay? So that is, and we might get back into this from a bit of another angle, but first let's go into how the Romans kill God, right? Because that, of course, is the other big thing. So the Romans are pagans, and again, as I have already said, pagans do still exist. I think people often forget that because they think that pagans are basically like Greek and Mesopotamian pagans, and of course, Greeks are now Christians and Mesopotamians are now Muslims. So where have all the pagans gone? But we have, for example, the Japanese, and the Japanese love to kill God. Maybe you try to kind of like get into why. You can take the video. I don't know if you have like any other insights into Japanese culture. They're of course very much culturally present in the 21st century, and try to say why the Japanese love to kill God.
It's been a while since I watched the video. It was an interesting video. But I mean, it's like lowercase gods in the case of like the Japanese. So it's not.
Okay, let me ask it in a different way, because people are actually kind of like undecided about this, and some say this should go this way, and others say this should go that way. Is it good for the Japanese to desire to kill gods, or is it good for the Japanese to kind of like have a mock ritual in the form of a video game of killing a god?
Well, actually, I would say, if from a Christian perspective, I would say it's not even bad in certain sense, because it's like iconoclastic, right? In a certain sense, like if you kill enough gods, maybe eventually get to the one you really need to get to, right? And then, in a certain sense, I mean, following what you have said, given that the pagan is elevated away from his fallen state, that it is good that the Japs go on shooting some more, stabbing some more.
Okay, so there is opinions that go along the way of, since Christianity, since Catholicism specifically, is the perfection of religiosity in itself. That means that it is best for people who have not been sufficiently exposed to Catholicism to maximally try to live their own faith, in order so that they may ideally be prepared for Catholicism, because the more properly spiritual they are, the more aspects of Catholicism they already have, the more someone who missions to them can build upon. And so the more or the easier they will be to save. That is an argument which I would even in a sense share, but I would actually say that the killing of gods is part of proper religiosity. And that if we make this argument, then going to the pagan temple doesn't cut it, because you need to distrust the deity. Right? So we with anything in our world, we always have two ways of trying to approach them. One is intimation, the other one is extimation. That's what I call them. So, I've forgotten the name, Greek philosopher, it's called love and strife. There's many different ways which we can call them. But basically, it's about, do you want to sort of have it be part of you, right? Fuse with it? Or do you want to take it apart, right? And of course, other than those two,
language.
in the alchemical exactly, in the alchemical tradition, it would be coagulation. If you sort of like have it draw apart, or do you dissolve it with something else or yourself? The chemical tradition is sort of dissociative in that sense, right? So to intimate something is to sort of try to synchronize with it, if that makes sense, right? To get on one wavelength with it, to get along with it, to fuse with it, to become one with it, right? The greatest intimate, we now have basically manufactured intimation events, which is what the kind of like Woodstock or other big musical events are like, right? The medium of having music play, which sort of sets even the rhythm of your heart, kind of like gets them into sync, is what allows for a sort of like group feeling of intimation, right? Extimation, also intimation, is basically unity, becoming one, trust. It's the feminine approach to other things. So women tend to want to externally intimate, whilst men tend to want to externally extimate, and then in vice versa, women want to internally extimate and men want to internally intimate, which is also another reason why men are actually the nominative sex of the two sexes. So basically what this means is,
what did you say, nominative?
Nominative because basically, or normative, not normative.
Normative, okay.
Right? Because on the face, like exteriorly, the man also extimates, and interiorly, he also intimates. So a woman is way more likely to be in a conflict with herself, right? Whilst at the same time trying to be in a sort of sync with the world around herself, right? And with a man, it's inverse. A man is much more likely to be in the conflict with the world around himself, whilst he is attempting to be in sync with himself, right? Or much more likely to be in sync with himself, right? So he internally intimates. He intimates all the aspects of himself, and he can do this with a much higher efficiency than a woman can, right? But in return, he externally extimates.
Like you need to be perfectly mobilized and structured through these inner intimations to have an focus or pressure on like an external affair, right? Like
it doesn't need to go. It doesn't need to go that way. You can also, through an external extimation, intimate internally. Because, and this is also something from the other video, so I would just also put it here.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the synergy, like you cannot have like both extimation inside and outside. Like you need to like be unified to then like divide outside of yourself in some sense.
Well, you can have it in some certain capacity, right? You can have, let's say, you can have a day where you externally extimate and internally extimate, and vice versa, right? Externally intimate, internally intimate. but there's a tendency, because these things are often trade-offs, because there's often issues which can't be, let's say, multilaterally addressed that way, right? There are issues which can be, but there's issues which can't be. And if there are these issues which can't be, a woman will try to let the world be and go into herself and basically have that fight inside herself, whilst a man will take his stance and then try to have that fight inside the world, right? And the reason this is also important is because the way we are is the way our psyche works is that it's basically a refractory reflection of the different settings and environments which we are in, and especially the persons within them. So basically, our psyche organizes itself through subpersonalities. And actually, what happens, for example, when you smoke weed, is that what can happen to you, and I actually have friends to whom this has happened, is that let's say subpersonalities, which should be in a proper order through what the brain actually organizes through its interior time, which works in a similar way to how servers actually work, which also keep themselves ordered via the clock, is that they can basically, like, subpersonalities can be sort of like what you could separate it from the main time flow and then be in a direct exchange with you, which is what you actually have when you're hearing voices, right? So without going into the situation of my friend too much, he basically had voices which were not him tell him certain things, threaten him, try to bribe him, try to be nice to him, and so on and so forth, which he was in exchange with which he could address using his own voice, but which, let's say, if you would examine this, were actually very obviously also just parts of his own way of thinking. Because when he noticed something, he wouldn't notice it correctly. Rather, the other voice would notice it on his behalf, in a sense, and then also put a spin on this, right? So let's say,
it's kind of like when you maybe, I don't know if that's a common experience or something I just have, but when you're like almost drifting off to sleep and you just have like babble in your head and you kind of like have these thoughts, and then you notice that you're just babbling with like your interior monologue, and then you have like a comment on that interior monologue itself. It's like an interior voice and blah blah blah. Kind of like
an interior monologue is not schizophrenia.
or maybe
Let me
interior
give you an
dialogue
example.
is what do I know, right?
No, an interior dialogue also isn't schizophrenia. Let me give you an example. So you look at a table, right? You look at a table and there's a knife on it, for example. Normally, people notice that there's a knife on it. Now, we don't notice that we notice because it's something that happens all the time, right? We scan our entire environment, and then we say, oh, there's a knife, right? Where we say, oh, there's a book, there's a glass, so on and so forth. But if somebody asks us, right, what is there? Have you noticed the knife? We will immediately say yes, because it's something that is kind of like present in our own understanding of the environment as it is at the moment. And our own understanding of the environment as it is at the moment isn't necessarily the environment as it actually is, which is also important, right? For example, the way we are currently in socially can actually manipulate our resonance with the environment with which we are in. We will we can miss objects, for example, in the environment if there's a social reason for us to miss them, which is quite interesting. Anyways, so you look at the table, there's a knife, right? You will notice the knife, right? I'm actually just looking at a knife in my room right now, and I've noticed the knife because of talk about knives, and I will pick up the knife. Don't worry, I won't do anything with it. But the person who has this certain sense of schizophrenia will not notice the knife in that way. Instead, he will not either not notice it, or the voice will basically tell him, oh, there's a knife, why don't you stab yourself with it? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
So only by the voice telling him about it does he actually notice the knife, right? So that is something which he would otherwise do naturally, but because this part of the brain is sort of like
basically in the perverted where an unconscious faculty is, well, conscious, you could say. I mean,
semi-conscious, yes, exactly.
Semi-conscious, yeah.
Semi-conscious. right? And that is why we call it a legit brain disorder, right? Because there's actually just something wrong in the way the brain is wired, which is what you change when you take weed, right? You change the wiring of the brain, and which is why, for example, you dissociate from time whilst you're high, right? So you have a very, very different experience of time when you're tripping, because basically what happens is that where the brain normally sort of like creates its own time ticking rate, right? And through this creates a hierarchy, which is also, by the way, all the mystical people, I don't know, most people probably don't know this because most people aren't like former occultists, but all the mystical people who are on about like Saturn controlling the world and stuff like that, this is because there's a genuine mystical insight into time and hierarchy being codependent on one another, right? You need time to create hierarchy, and you need a hierarchy to create time. They're codependent entities, right?
Okay.
And
how is that
there's
codependence exactly play out? Like,
so there's I will I will refer to a channel which is called Dialect, which is on YouTube, which is one of my absolute favorite channels. And basically, all they do is they go into the weed of special relativity, and they kind of show what special relativity isn't, and how it does and doesn't function, and how to sort of like transcend the dilemmas which special relativity purports to bring. And there you can see why time and hierarchy are codependent, because time and observation and hierarchy of observation are codependent in a physical sense, right? Then they are codependent in a practical sense, because you always need someone who basically is the biggest clock, or who is the main clock that sets all the other clocks, right? And that is the way in which hierarchy needs, in which time needs hierarchy, right? Because otherwise you have, again, sort of like time ambivalence, and that would lead into problems of paradoxes, which a paradox is basically, ultimately, if you break it down far enough, it can always be just, well, or a paradox which results from time problems can always just be seen as a destruction of chronology. So either you accept that time needs hierarchy, or you don't accept a linear flow of time. So you can say, if there is no linear flow of time, and time actually is completely ambivalent and flows into all directions at the same time, and we don't know even what causation is, and we like do bad time travel movies like Back into the Future, then you don't need hierarchy, right? You only need hierarchy if you want time to flow into one direction, which most people generally want to do. And it's the same for the brain. If we want the brain to be able to follow a common stream of consciousness, as we call it, then we want it to have a certain hierarchy within itself. If we don't want to follow it to follow a certain stream of consciousness, then we actually can have it be ambivalent. And that is basically also another thing we see with certain ways in which people are insane, is that they can't follow a stream of consciousness, that they can't keep on track in a conversation, in a setting. And that is basically because their inner hierarchy is completely destroyed, right? And then we also see the same in a social setting, right? So a society which does have no hierarchy has no cohesive progress which it makes into any one direction, because it cannot organize itself, right? And a society which does have no common time is not able to produce a common hierarchy. So again, time and hierarchy are very much interdependent concepts, right? And also what should,
if you look at, like, at least on a societal level, like time is like scheduling and management, and scheduling is like important to like goals that are set, and they are set by an authority and so on. So it's like
yes, it's also because time always implies alternatives. So there is a time because something happens while something else could happen, right? If nothing else could happen, then time isn't a real dimension. And which is also, by the way, why time and money are so interconnected. Money only exists because time exists, but time doesn't exist because money exists.
Obviously.
Yeah. So, but because money also is just basically the transmittent object which helps us deal with the fact that we have alternative uses for the time which is allotted to us, and to properly, and that is of course basically the failure of communism, to realize this is that what money really does is just organize time, right? And therefore it also needs to be hierarchical, right? Which is, if you go into like basic economics, the classical like Robinson Crusoe economy of Robinson can produce so and so many fish, and the indigenous man can produce so and so many coconuts. And actually, if one specializes on fish and the other one specializes on coconuts, and they exchange with one another, then we actually have the maximum amount of fish and coconuts. That's just because of time, right? Like time is the obvious factor here. It's that one gets more done in a certain allotted amount of time, and that's basically the entire basis for a market economy, is that people need different amounts of time to do things. And it's also the entire reason why market economies need people like myself who work in finance, because finance people actually only do two things. One is we give accurate data, and the other one is we just ask what needs to do, like what has which priority and which time allotted to it, right? And that's why we also generally tend to run companies, because we are just the time people, the timekeeper people, basically. That's like the secret behind finance, is that money really is time in a sort of transferative sense. Anyways, we were getting onto this train of thought because we were talking about the Japanese dealing with gods and with divinities and with killing gods, and with killing gods in order to hopefully at some point get into the right god, and then into the question of intimating something and extimating something. So when you intimate it, again, you become one with it, you sync with it, right? Ultimately, the ultimate goal of Christianity is to intimate that God in that way in which he is available to us, right? Which is also individualizing for each person, because every person is their own divine idea. Every divine idea is a different reflection of the complete divinity of God, which is limited, but perfect. And then to achieve what we would call theosis would be to intimate the divine idea into our own being. Extimation is basically the separation of an object, right? So if you extimate something, then you approach it with the attempt of creating something, or of pulling something apart, with the desired achievement of a non-physical but intellectual gain. Extimation only ever really, we don't, well, it's not, well, to be fair, it doesn't have to be the specific goal, but it's actually the only use which extimation has. So an extimate act only actually ever produces information, right? It doesn't produce something physical in a sense. Okay, so
not direct.
the fruitfulness, abundance, right? These are elements of intimation, and of course we can typologize this through marriage, right? If you are married, you're intimate, and then you beget fruit that is abundant. It sprouts from your new life, perfect. Now, if you're a farmer, you're intimate with your field, right? You're only extimate with things which harm your field, and there you destroy them, and then in destroying them, you actually gain information about how they work, which helps you destroy them better, right? But there's no positive action in this. So this extimation actually, as a positive good, only yields knowledge for further destruction, right? But you are, with the field, you're basically intimate, because you basically try to be in sync with the field, right? And then if you were in a factory, you're also technically supposed to be intimate with that which the factory produces and that which how it works. So All of these would be intermative acts because you do not question the factory which you yourself built, right? You question it in the sense of gaining knowledge about it to optimize it, but then again, you question it with the intent of gaining knowledge, right? But you do not question it for a material gain. So intimating is always for the purpose of abundance, right? Or of completeness, and then extimating is always actually for the gain of knowledge. Okay. So again, we ourselves are a reflection, which is something I started in before we got into time. We ourselves are a reflection of the world around us, parted into subpersonalities, right? These subpersonalities make up a hierarchy within our own mind, which maps itself onto the social environment which we are in. So basically, you have a jock in your class, right? I'd love to do a classroom. You have a jock in your class and you have a nerd in your class. And then the jock in your class basically becomes influences a subpersonality which is inside of you, which more or less represents something like it's not directly a jock, but something like a Platonic idea
Just
of a
an
jock, or
outgoing person that's
Jungian archetype of a jock. Yeah, something like that. So competitive, outgoing, kind of like certain attributes, and you actually also kind of like break apart these elements, put them into one another, and so on and so forth. So you have multiple jocks, and you sort of cross-reference the impressions they give to you to derive what is, let's say, a more proper ordering of the attributes which they exhibit. But ultimately, you have something like a jock, which sort of takes up a part of your subpersonalities, which you can then express or otherwise make use of. And then at the same time, you have a nerd in your class, and he's very studious and he's very shy, so on and so forth. You amalgamate those aspects also into yourself, and then you basically say, okay, what does the one achieve? What does the other achieve? Right? The jock is good with people, and he maybe is good with girls and so on and so forth, and good at sports. The other one is good at school, and teachers like him. And then you say, okay, what are the goods that I want to achieve, right? What is my hierarchy of being, and what is my hierarchy of goods? And then you say, well, I really want to be good with other people, so I imitate the jock, so I give his being in my own hierarchy of being a higher place. That is basically what we do, right? That is basically how our psyche works all the time. And now, if there's an issue, a question, an unknown, right, we can try to estimate and challenge something. So, for example, the nerd character, tries to make a claim, or he goes into conflict with the jock character because he says the jock character gets the same grades as I do, right? He cheated, but he gets those because he cheated. And now you can basically, this is something which now also updates your inner pantheon, basically, or your inner state of characters and subpersonalities. Because basically, if the jock is able to get the same grades as the nerd, then if grades are your priority, you might switch to exhibiting more of the jock's characteristics within your own psyche, right? Because what you do is that you say, okay, the jock gets the good grades, but he also gets on top of that other things which I desire, right? And again, desire here doesn't necessarily mean need to like own something or dominate something, right? It's a desire in the wider form of something final, which we move towards, which again brings us to the point of finality, which kind of like ends itself into a sort of typology, which only ends in God and death. Anyways, so the jock basically, so there's now a conflict. Now, a woman would internalize this conflict, have it within herself in tandem with the outer world, see how the outer world handles the conflict, and then basically react to that within herself in a sort of observer mode. A man would be more likely to get involved in the conflict in order to see to it that the conflict happens properly, right? And this gets even further. So I hope everyone knows about the Santa Fe Institute. I know you guys don't. It's the only good think tank that remains. All the other ones have fallen. Academia has fallen. Millions of papers must be shredded. But Santa Fe is like the last remaining semi-good
place
think
where
tank.
Cormac McCarthy hanged before he died.
I don't know. I don't.
Yeah, no, he did. He had friends there. Like, he wasn't a physicist, but he was chatting them up.
Nice. Yeah, and we're all McCarthyists over here, so.
He didn't
anyways,
save him by anything.
Santa Fe has a talk, and I don't know the name at the moment. It's something like common computation amongst primates or something, or amongst monkeys. Just like look at computation, primates, monkeys, hierarchies. You should find it. It's given by a blonde woman, if that helps. And basically, what she talks about is the reason why monkeys fight. And the reason why monkeys fight is to find out who's the strongest monkey, which is not a big insight, to be fair, right? But the interesting thing is that they actually, in common, as a monkey group, as a monkey tribe, compute the relative strength of all monkeys relative to one another. So there's a sort of like bit rate which is exchanged between the monkeys and between also the way in which they choose fights, because they actually also even choose fights in order to more or less optimize the computation of strength between them, right? To create what is essentially an informational hierarchy of which monkey is the strongest. And the stronger the monkey is, the more he is able to police the behaviors of other monkeys, right? So it is very much a might makes right situation. But the really interesting thing is that the strength computation actually is exponential. So you could look at a monkey fight, and you could get a feeling, if you observe it from the outside, that monkey A is able to beat monkey B, but afterwards he's very much exhausted, and I don't know, like you see him slow down and everything, and you go, okay, he probably doesn't really have the energy to fight even one more monkey. Okay, so monkey A beats monkey B by a small margin, right? And that's basically it, right? Now, for the monkeys, monkey A could be perceived as as strong as 6 other monkeys at the same time. So, in this common computation, both monkey A and the other monkeys will have something like a strength of 6 applied to him. So he can intimidate 6 monkeys at the same time from their tribe who know about him, right? And he will feel like he can take 6 monkeys, and they will feel like he can take them. So what happens here is basically that we create a sort of informational abstract pseudo-reality from continued estimation, right? And these sort of pseudo-realities are, in a sense, the basis for how human hierarchies also partially work, because there's very similar behaviors going on in humans. Now, they're not the only behaviors, but they do exist, and they play a big role in how human relationships work. And that is why you do have, in a pagan setting, gods which sort of rise through the ranks. Thor is one. The Chinese god of war, whose name I don't have off the top of my head at the moment, is one. I think even Hercules, many believe to be one in the making. They sort of rise through the social interaction of the members of the pagan world, right?
Yeah.
And they also rise up through the group dynamics, right? So the group dynamic tries to express a certain truth. This certain or this attempt at expressing the truth creates a hierarchy. This hierarchy enables individuals of the group to then influence the group in, let's say, disproportionate ways, right? Because it is very likely that the reason the monkeys sort of over calculate the strength of the strongest monkey is because that is the most or the optimal way for the monkeys to calculate the strength, because it's probably better for them to sort of invest additional, let's say, accidental strength into the strongest monkey so he can do more policing activities rather than to let's say, match him accurately to his strength, and thereby have most of the time the strongest monkey who isn't even able to end one fight, because if both of the fighting parties would decide to gang up on him instead, that would mean that they could beat him, right? So effectively, what we have is we have a biological convention that is very much or very likely due to the maximum efficiency of the outcome of what happens, right? So these things factor into the way humans work and into the way humans create pagan deities. So the pagan deity, or the pagan deity, is a necessity. It's something that happens naturally, which is also a question, right? Why do we naturally have gods, right? Because, of course, God is a supernatural entity, but humans naturally strive towards religiosity. So what is it that we have? And the reason is that we have a place for God within our own mind and psyche. And this God, and I hope this brings a lot of things together, and you can ask me questions after I finish this part, is a sort of like liquid entity which fuses the self, the group, the outer environment, and the higher or the realm of higher ideals, right? So, for example, we have a god of war, a god of commerce, and so on and so forth, which are all like more abstract entities. And all of these have to be synced with one another. The self with other individuals, but also with the group, but also with the world around him, but also with the world of ideas and concepts and conventions which he occupies. And the God is basically that which unifies these things into one common identity. Are you with me so far?
Maybe, I don't know. I'm a bit tired. Sometimes in my head, but yeah, gods, ideas, the reality, the truth, and so on. It's like human nature is receptive to that. I mean, yeah, I think it's not hyper controversial for anyone who's like, okay, who's religious or duh, or for weird Neoplatonists, I guess.
Yeah. So to kind of like, for example, for a Christian, right?
Yeah.
We know that this serves to have a proper place for God in our own psyche. And of course, this is because this kind of describes what God ultimately is to us, right? He is the one who is between us and other individuals, right? Because he is love, right?
Yeah.
He is the one who is between us and groups, right? That is mass, right? Mass is a group activity. It is not an activity of additive individuals, right? Groups at a certain point get too big for that, right? And a common parish, right? Maybe not nowadays, but a common parish is too big to be a collection of individuals. It becomes a group, right? And it
Yes.
exhibits group dynamics instead of individual dynamics, which are different. But he ties us also to the group dynamic in mass, and then also gives us, let's say, our marching orders into how to engage with individuals which aren't Christian, with individuals which we don't love naturally, which of course we read in the Bible that there's people whom we and all the pagans value the people whom they already love, right? But the Christian is to love their enemies, basically.
Yes.
And again, it also shows us how to engage with groups, that basically we are not to be of the world, which in this case means kind of like the wider social setting, and to not submit to them, right? And that again is because it would be akin to submitting to an animal, because groups become animals, and they very often become animals which consume their members, which is improper because they are of a lower order of being, right? Animals are not to consume humans, humans are to consume animals, right? So
Yes.
that is basically the magic of groups, is that a group needs to be lower than all the members which are part of it. But then also all the
Okay.
members which are part
So
of
that
it.
answers already the question. The Japs should kill these egregore gods because they are lower than them. And
Not quite, because
not
just
quite.
because something is lower than you doesn't give you necessarily the right, or the well, it gives you
Yeah, of
in a
course.
sense
Doesn't
the
mean you
right
have
to
the
kill it,
duty to kill it.
but it doesn't
Be
make good
quite
to kill it.
vicious.
Yeah, you don't kill your pet dog, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
also teleologically, your wife is below you, and you don't have rights to kill her. Like, full stop, right?
Wait, I can't
Um,
kill my children.
you also can't kill your children, exactly. Right? Um,
Yeah, makes sense.
and yeah, unfortunately. And anyways, so this doesn't give you the right to kill the egregore god, right? But this is still just kind of like trying to outline their dynamic, right? So
Yes.
God ties us to the other individual, to the group, to the world around us, right? Especially in early medieval art, you see this a lot, like God as the creator of the cosmos, and then the king, which is of course the face and the head of the group, taking his place in a proper way in the cosmos, and then the people taking their place in the proper way below the king, which is how you have the individual, which is the king, which represents the group, which takes place in the cosmos. And all of this gives rise to the different conventions and ideals which occupy basically the interactive space of humanity. And this is then a perfect order which gives glory to God. And that is how early medieval art often works, right?
Interesting.
Um, because God is none of these things, right? And he is none of these things, and he is all of these things at the same time. So the thing with all of this is that you need to kill, or you need to transcend the egregore god, and or you can kill the egregore god in order to achieve individuation or theosis, right? Because a group can become, again, can eat itself up. It can become defective. It can become, the egregore can basically run loose, can become something akin to a cancer. And in this case, the group actually has a sort of instinct to revive itself. And groups, and this is very important, groups revive themselves through individuals, not through groups. And this is something we like to ape in an election. Right? The idea behind an election is that every time the social setting cannibalizes itself, it sort of creates a champion which rises through the top of it and then sets it into a new
Mm.
order.
Yeah.
And the problem is with Western democracy is that it has forgotten most of this and has kind of like stressed the wrong parts of this dynamic and amplified the wrong parts. Because nowadays, what has become what we call democracy is basically the open society. And what the open society means is that you do not have any sort of boundary setting, time giving, hierarchy forming, right? Because again, these are interconnecting things, right? You need
Yeah.
for hierarchies, you need boundaries. For hierarchies, you need time. For time, you need hierarchies and boundaries, and so on and so forth, right? Discrete entities, so on and so forth. Now, all of these things are necessary, and they can decay, and they can then be rejuvenated. Now, in a feudalist system, for example, this would happen not through an election, right, which is kind of a sort of idealism, which actually does have a place in feudalism because a feudal king actually is in a sense elected. So, for example, all the Holy Roman Emperors would go to my city, or Frankfurt, and go into the Frankfurt town hall, and there would actually be people who represented the Romans who kind of like threw up their hats and everything, and this signed the Romans delighting in the new emperor and thereby electing him. Because there actually was a question with the start of the HRE whether the Holy Roman Emperor was elected, had his right by conquest, or by church fiat. And ultimately, the HRE settled on church fiat, and actually the other two empires which Germany had, the second right was made by right of conquest, and then the Third Reich was made by right of election. So we actually tried all three, and right by fiat lasted 1,000 years, and the other one was shorter.
Yeah.
But the thing is that in a feudal system, the king either is deposed by his son, which is a source of rejuvenation, or by a rival claimant, which is also a sort of rejuvenation. So that is how the HRE kept constantly rejuvenating itself. And then, for example, in the United States, the way it works is, or was supposed to work, is that this rejuvenation comes through the people who collectively elect someone to sort of like bring forth that rejuvenation. Of course, that is also the hope with someone like Donald Trump. Was the hope before that with Barack Obama, who was kind of created to look like a rejuvenating force. And again, it's just it's the ongoing promise of Washington, right? Is that I will do it differently, and then of course people get into Washington, and the entire state machine of the United States basically works on enforcing a certain idea of society, which is being enforced by entities which are not part of the elected government.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the dilemma they're having. And then in Germany, I think most people at this point understand that Germany doesn't really work democratically. It's just more of a firm-led entity which is weirdly dependent on other people's foreign policy.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah, it's all of these are throw aside. So the thing is the Japanese person tries to kill God not just because they feel that the egregore has become hostile, but also because kind of like how Siegfried slays the dragon. Siegfried, of course, gains the dragon's power, right? The god is that which occupies this field of combining a place in the world with a place in society, with a relation to other people, with a relation to the ideals of the world, which means that if that place is not accessible through intimation, it is taken through extirpation, basically by replacing that which holds the place, right?
Yeah.
So you need to kill God in order to become human, and that is something which is very, very, very pagan, right? That and so there are, of course, these pagan figures which are then gods, right? Alexander is something like that. Again, the Chinese god of war name still eludes me, is something like that. The Buddha is something like that, not quite, but almost. And all of these figures, however, function like saints, and saints actually are lowercase g gods in Christianity. The Old Testament literally calls them that, calls the Mosaic judges, for example, gods lowercase g, right? So the Christian also has something like this. However, the difference is basically that the pagan only is able to achieve this for one member of the group who takes charge of it and lives a full life, right? And then becomes something like a pseudo saint and the blueprint for a new god very often, right? And this is, for example, what happens in the Meiji Restoration. And then also something else that's also important with the Japanese gods and with the way the Japanese films work and the video works about the killing of Japanese gods is that the way it is made seem, and a way it is often made seem to people in the West, is that the Japanese system is uniquely terrible, right? It's basically terrifying, inhumane, just crushes you, and there's nothing you get from it. You basically get produced, right? You don't even get born, you get produced, and then you're pushed into school, and then you have like extracurricular activities after school, so that you are basically working already when you're just 7 years old, first in school for 8 hours, and then on your extracurriculars for 8 hours, and then you fall into bed, and then you repeat it the next day, and you maybe get a Sunday off, right? And everyone hates themselves and represses themselves because nobody can speak up against the social contract of Japan, and so on and so forth. That's basically how Japanese society is presented, and there is truth to that. But what people don't understand is the things which the system also produces. Aside from, because what he does in this video is basically he says, oh, it produces conspicuous consumption, right? So basically, you have the idea of, well, I can own a big car, I can own a nice house, I can so on and so forth, for a nice holiday, and that makes it worth it that I sacrifice myself for the corporate machine which I am in. But that's not the only thing that people get. And so, for example, I want to take extracurricular activity of piano practice, right? Because kids get hounded into piano practice in Japan, right? And just like, you have to take it for 12 years, but after 12 years of learning the piano and being beaten over it, well, they don't beat their children. Well, sometimes they do, but anyways, after 12 years of piano practice, which is very harsh, you actually can play the piano, and it's fun. It's something which you couldn't do otherwise, and that is also things you get from the incredible harsh environment which the Japanese people are under. So the point I'm trying to get to is the next point, and that is Japanese people die, in a sense, for their false gods, right? And this is kind of getting us back into the human sacrifice question, because this is something I also want to talk about. Every religion in the world, everyone has human sacrifice, right? And for example, if we get into Japan, to the Meiji Restoration, just for people who don't know it, the Meiji Restoration was basically the idea of taking a pagan civilization and turning it into the spiritual equivalent of a Christian civilization, under the recognition that a political order follows from spiritual convictions. So the emperor becomes a pseudo-messianic figure, which is, let's say, the descendant or incarnate form of a pseudo-monotheistic deity, under which there's, let's say, a pseudo hierarchy of angels and saints, all of which forms a sort of like pseudo-Christianity. And it was designed to basically imitate the absolutist conception of Catholicism and Protestantism, which was alive at the time, which is, for example, exemplified in Prussia, which the Meiji Restoration heavily oriented itself around, or in France, which the Meiji Restoration also heavily oriented itself around. Which is why nowadays still the Japanese have such a cultural, high cultural appreciation for both Germany and the French. And basically, so what the Meiji does, again, tries to imitate Christianity, and that means it also takes the human sacrifice idea from Christianity. Because what is the human sacrifice? The two human sacrifices which happen in Christianity. Now back to you. I know you're very tired, but we'll still ask you.
Well, yeah, it's good, so I can maybe wake up myself a little bit. Two human sacrifices in Christianity. I mean, we all know Christ, and the other one is Isaac, right?
Isaac is actually a typology of Christ, but nice that you mentioned Isaac. But there's actually, at Mass, right, we live through the sacrifice of Christ again. But the sacrifice of Christ is actually at Mass matched by your own
if you want to
sacrifice.
separate, you can say the liturgy as sacrifice, and
No, I don't mean that separate from the sacrifice of Christ. I mean, Christ is sacrificed at Mass, and we sacrifice ourselves mirroring Christ also at Mass. That is what you're supposed to do at Mass, is you dedicate yourself. That is what you do when you receive the Eucharist, basically.
Yes.
You receive him sacrificing himself by sacrificing yourself to him, right? You give up your own life during Mass, and you render it upon him, and he gives up his own life and renders it upon you, right? But because you are the lower part, because you're the bodily part, because you take the female role in respect to God.
Yes.
You, when you lay down your life, what you actually lay down is your spirit, right, which he then occupies. Your ego, your
Oh, yeah.
will, and so on and so forth, right? But you still lay down your life, and this is something which the Japanese copy, right? The human sacrifice in post Meiji Restoration Japan is the sacrifice of the individual to the others, to the group, right? And that is why kamikaze,
Yes.
which is actually has another name, but
Did
I
you
don't
watch the
have it.
Godzilla movie? I'm sorry to interject,
No,
but did you watch Godzilla
no,
-1? Like, you
no.
should. I think you would like it. And it's like, you can get some pseudo-Christian symbolism in there if you like, if you look for it. Well, not symbolism, but like the message, the theme, you know.
Okay.
It's a
Um,
nice movie.
haven't watched it. Might watch it. Maybe watch it together.
Yeah, sure.
anyways,
Fun stuff.
anyways. Um, so it is the sacrifice of the individual, and kamikaze, which again, kami is the word for God and or for divinity, and then kaze is wind. Um, the actual name of it, and it eludes me, I'm sorry, but also has a very strong religious connotation to it. And of course, it needs to have this very strong religious connotation to it because it is an act of suicide, right? So what this exemplifies is that in Japanese religiosity, there's a human sacrifice and suicide, right? You kill yourself for the God of Japan. And this is basically what structurally has remained in post World War II Japan, is that you kill yourself the same way a Christian kills himself, right? Through self-dedication, through
Yes.
to Christ. So the Japanese man kills himself through self-dedication to Mitsubishi. And that
Yes.
is why Mitsubishi is basically the false god of Japan, and why he can only achieve individuation in one or two ways. Either he slays the god, or he becomes the CEO of Mitsubishi, basically,
Yeah.
right? Or a higher functioning part of Mitsubishi. And then in both of these approaches, he actually has a gain because he basically has a sort of like localized right-handed path of trying to exemplify that which makes a good Mitsubishi employee, rising through the Mitsubishi ranks, and then getting to the Mitsubishi top. And through that, as with the piano practice, he he can maybe, and this depends on how properly ordered Mitsubishi is, achieve things which are actually, let's say, perfecting himself in a satisfying and spiritually enriching manner. And then, especially if he questions the righteousness of Mitsubishi, he then can, let's say, attempt to revoke it and to rebel against it and to slay the divinity. Okay,
Yeah.
so that is sort of like um, the general idea of slaying divinity, right? Is you always have the idea of intimation and of extimation, right? You intimate with something only insofar as, or the intimation with Mitsubishi or with another false god is only ever useful insofar as that this thing is properly ordered. And we know all pagan gods ultimately are not. So intimating yourself with a pagan deity, with a pagan community, with a pagan other individual. This is what the Swedish song Hermanelik is about, right? Hermanelik, Hermanelik. If you guys don't know it, look it up. Hermanelik is about a Christian man who is being pursued by a pagan woman, and she tries to give him all these gifts and so on and so forth. And he always says no because you're an ugly troll, which in Sweden doesn't mean like the big green hairy thing, but more like a witch. And I can't be with you for that reason, right? So that is the reason is because he can't intimate with something which is improperly ordered, because intimating with it would mean that he would have to mirror that improper order, right? And thereby he would turn himself away from God. And then she, in Hermanlik, the woman, the troll, she actually, in the end, she is sad that he won't elect her or select her as his wife, because she thinks that otherwise she cannot be saved. Because if she tries to intimate with him, she hopes that basically through intimation she will intimate onto his proper order and their self. But what she actually needs to be is she first needs to be extirpated, which would be to, let's say, engage her, to be in conflict with her, which would then give the ability to, let's say, tear away what is obstructing, which is keeping her from growing into proper order, and only then can she intimate with something which is properly ordered. All of this is to say that pagans need to question their gods to be good pagans. And that is why, especially the pagans, and why doubting Thomas is in a sense the most pagan of the apostles, and why Longinus is rewarded for questioning Christ, because that's what he does when he pierces Christ. And that's of course what you do when you extirpate. When you extirpate, you cut apart, right? You decide,
Yes.
which is where the word for decision comes from, right? It's just cutting apart, cleaving apart, separating things, and then giving therefore room for proper things to grow there. That's what Longinus does. He questions whether or not Christ is alive. He pierces his side, water and blood comes flowing out, which are the sanctifying pieces. And again, going back to the Jews, right? They deny having the blood of Christ on their hands. Longinus has it pouring on himself and thereby is redeemed. So because he accepts it, he can be redeemed.
Right.
Because he doubted, he ultimately still accepts it. And it's also, again, a dichotomy between Thomas and Longinus, because Longinus doubts physically, Thomas doubts spiritually or intellectually, right? Because
Yes.
in the end, Thomas is a Jew and Longinus is a Roman. So the pagan is, let's say, experiencing this on a more carnal level, right? Whilst the Jew is experiencing this on a more spiritual level, because he takes up the seniority role, right? Right? Because he should already, going back to the very beginning, be familiarized with the fact that his environment is incarnate, right? Which means carnal, which means physical, which means that the physical environment which he is surrounded by virtue of being an oldest son of the human race, is basically aligned in such a way that he can immediately translate it into a spiritually or materially, spiritually or ideologically relevant construct from which he can derive immediate spiritual truths, which is why he doesn't need to cut Christ physically in order to understand that he is God physically, but why he can still doubt intellectually and then make his doubt confirmed by then touching Christ, who is then actually physically there.
Yeah.
Okay, so need to kill God, but we can't kill the real God, which is also something which you spoke about,
Yeah.
right? We can't kill the real God because the real God, of course, basically is existence itself, and it would be or is subsisting existence itself, if we want to go like fully Thomistic. And basically, that is that would be, of course, illogical. So, what do we do, or what happens actually? What happens when we kill God? And of course, this is also perfected in the death of Christ, and that is we kill our fellow man, because Christ, and here we once again have to understand the hypostatic union, is Christ is fully God and fully man, and as full man, he laid down his full life, right? And of course, as God, he can't die, right? This is something like which Muslims sometimes try to bring up, which is like, oh, if Christ is God, then how did he die on the cross? It's like, first of all, you don't even believe that he died on the cross, but second of all, it's not God who died on the cross. It's Christ who's fully man who died on the cross, right? And then there's the question, well, if he's fully God and fully man, how can he be basically die as the one and not die as the other? And the answer to that is basically, well, he died, right? And the one part can't die, but it's basically well, to make it more like more easily understood, is when you die, your soul also doesn't die, right? And Christ's soul is basically, well, more or less God. I don't want to get into it, but we can basically put it like that. And that's also a reason why he resurrects afterwards, right? Because he doesn't he's fully man and fully God, so he resurrects. Anyways, so what happens is that the man is killed, and that gets again into the question of human sacrifice. Now, do you know René Girard?
Yes, I
Do you know
know.
what his
Yeah,
shtick is?
yeah. It's about the scapegoat and everything.
It's about scapegoating, exactly. How does scapegoat work?
Oh, scapegoat works that you have the group. There's a tension in the group. Something bad happened, whatever, and then you pick someone else in the group, or someone outside the group, who knows, and they pay for it. They may be killed for it or punished for it, and then the tension in the social gathering dissolves itself, and
Exactly.
that's the scapegoat.
So trying to put this into the term of egregore, can you combine the egregore with the scapegoat?
With the scapegoat, are you trying to say the individual that reworks the egregore is like the scapegoat or something else? That doesn't seem right.
Can be.
Egregore,
Actually
yeah,
can be.
it
Not
can, but
doesn't
it
need
doesn't
to be.
have to be. Yes, sure. But egregore, scapegoat.
Very simple, actually. Egregores eat people in order to survive. These people are scapegoats, right? And then these people can be eaten in such a way that they actually take over the egregore, which is again how you have a sort of like salvific element, right? So a person who takes over a group and becomes let's say, god king of the group, right? If he does so organically, and actually the best example for this is actually the election of Donald Trump in 2016. In the beginning, he will be mostly, or he will have, or the egregore will target him as a scapegoat, to put it this way. So the egregore as a disincarnate entity, or as a partially incarnate entity, I guess, or as an intermediary entity between the members of a group, has a limited capacity to sustain itself, right? To basically create autopoiesis. And the main way in which it can protect itself, and let's say in which it can survive, is that it can produce for its members at least the illusion of providing to them such a good that they will consciously try to keep it alive, right? Or at least semi-consciously try to keep it alive. So there's like different stages of interacting with an egregore. You can interact with them completely accidentally, and they basically just appear as like a side appearance. You can engage with them unconsciously, so you actually work with them, and work for their betterment, but through the desires of your unconscious, right? And this, of course, might lead to completely hostile egregores, which people aren't aware of. You can work with them semi-consciously. This is the point where you know that you're in a group and that this group has its own dynamic, but you don't understand that this group dynamic is basically an entity that needs to be sustained, or that can be sustained. And then you can work with them consciously, which means that you know that you are in a group, you know that this group has a dynamic, you know that this group dynamic needs to be sustained, which is, for example, how people properly approach church, if they approach church properly. So basically, people who try to keep their parish community together and to evangelize and bring new people into the parish community and so on and so forth, they're very much aware that they're part of a group and that this group is a dynamic and that they need to also see to it that this group doesn't break apart, right? And especially on the semi-conscious level, people tend to do scapegoating, right? Because they want to maintain the group, but there is an issue which, let's say, threatens the group, and then to resolve the issue, they scapegoat, right? So scapegoating is something which also kind of comes out of the psychological interconnectivity within um, group members, right? So again, when I'm in a group, basically I project inner parts of myself onto other members in the group. They do the same, right? So for them, the inner jock is, I don't know, Steve, and then for the guy over there, the inner jock is also Steve, right? But for Steve, the inner jock is Benny, and he also has an inner nerd, and so on and so forth, right? So when you have a group, you sort of like have a pact of personalities which interact in a certain way and belong together in a certain way. Basically, the conflict within a group is also always at the same time thereby mirrored as a psychological conflict within its members, right? And this means that the members now get into an exterminating option. And this means cutting someone out from the group or somehow otherwise doing a selection. That is how the typical scapegoat works, because it's basically a calculation as to how to remove someone from the group in such a way that the group is the least, or that the group functions or continues to function the best. So in the question of what happened if there's a group conflict, it's actually not a question of who is ultimately actually at fault in a direct sense, but it is who is threatening the group's identity the most. So, for example, you have, and this is something you guys might have realized or seen in your own social environments. So you have a group of friends, and then one friend steals an item from the other friend or borrows an item and doesn't give it back, right? So Benny steals, I don't know, well, it shouldn't be something which is like super drastic, like a phone or something, but Benny steals an umbrella from Steve, something very simple, right? He just takes it away because he basically is like, oh, I need, like, he stays over, takes the umbrella, goes away with it, never asked if he could have it, right? And then at some point, basically, Steve goes up to Benny and says, you still have my umbrella, give it back, right? So we see that Steve definitely is in the right, right? Benny took the umbrella without asking. It's Steve's umbrella. Depending on how Steve engages in this conflict, he can actually end up being the one who's ejected from the group, because he becomes the problem to how the group functions. Right? This is something a lot of people kind of need to learn. Being right doesn't mean that other people will find it to be the right thing to agree with you, right? Or what also happens
Yes.
in an idea like this is that Steve gets his umbrella, but he also gets ejected from the group, right? And ejecting someone from a social group is basically the most simple sense of scapegoating, right? And then
Yeah.
these kind of things increase in a sort of level of cardinality as we get into human sacrifice, right? And human sacrifice basically is the idea of delivering someone unto finality, delivering someone unto God in order to close a chapter. Because we've already spoken about time and how time creates hierarchy, and time needs critical moments to transfer through. And a critical moment can be induced, for example, through um, let's say a sufficient amount of emotion. So basically, what happens is that you partake in a public festival, a la Mayas, and there is a human sacrifice going on, and this human sacrifice marks the transition from one state into another state. So everything that was before now isn't, because the world has changed. And this is something that also happens in Mass, right? The world after Mass should be different to a Christian than the world was before Mass. And this is also, to kind of go back into all of this, what happens, of course, with the incarnation of Christ. The world after the incarnation of Christ is different than the world before the incarnation of Christ. And the tribe of Judah after the incarnation of Christ is different than the tribe of Judah before the incarnation of Christ, right? Everything changes. And the egregore, right, which was basically being prepared by God, was actually drenched in the blood of that which it was supposed to nurture, and thereby again sanctified into becoming the church. And this actually goes a bit deeper, because again, the blood drenches the cross. The cross is the institution by which Christ was martyred, and becomes the basis of the church in that sense also, right? Because the cross is in a sense the physical object which the Romans provide to martyr Christ, is then through it's a rigid tree, right? It's a physical wooden object tree, which is defective. It can't grow anymore. And then and again, this is something which you see in high medieval art. You have a lot of crosses where this is something also in contemporary art that's very popular actually, is that crosses which have like leaves sprouting from them, because the blood on the cross makes the cross fecund. But also medieval art, the blood of Christ actually becomes flowers itself. So Christ has like blood flowering out of him, right? Because again, the blood of Christ is what makes the cross fecund. So going back to the idea that the group is that which needs to sort of at least attempt to devour the individual, right, in order to sustain itself. It's also the case that if we engage in group settings, we always need to commit to a certain self-sacrifice, right? This is proper etiquette. This is the logical necessity of kind of like trying to or having to take account of multiple opinions. For example, where do we go to eat, right? You're not always going to go to eat where you want to go to eat. So there's at least a capacity you have to sort of limit your own wants and needs in order to enter into a group. So entering into a group always means that you sort of commit a sacrifice in order again to access that which the group promises you, right? And once you lose the ability to promise or to properly access that which the group promises, which is the point at which the group goes into conflict, that is the point actually where the sacrifice which you make for the group becomes a negotiable entity, right? Because the sacrifice you made for the group was only ever sacrifice insofar as you were willing to do this in order so that you may be member of the group. And why is this important? Because the idol of the Hebrews is membership within the elect of God, right? And that is also the big irony of their genocide, right? Of the genocide of I'm not going to say the name. It's actually a Christian name. It's a Christian appropriated word. The Jewish name is the Shoah. And the Christian name is actually something which we're called to ourselves. If you read many saints, they often speak of the Holocaust as something which they do for themselves because it's a burnt offering, exactly. But the genocide, which they call the Shoah, of course, results from Germany accepting an ideology of racial self-election, right? And this ideology is actually something which, if you go through it, and this is especially if you read Lee Keown, which is the first minister of Singapore, if you read his autobiography, you learn how it was like to live under British colonial rule. And in British colonial rule, many of the colonial subjects actually believed the British to be a different semi-divine race. And this is because in Great Britain, you have the combination of, on the one hand, Hinduistic belief about the strict racially divided caste systems, which kind of become in vogue in Britain, but also you have the influx of Jewish individuals into the higher states of or into the higher ranks of British nobility and financial power, who bring with them, let's say, the at that time newly developed ideas of Jewish chauvinism. And something which a lot of people don't know is that there actually was a movement that was almost identical to National Socialism in its sort of like racially chauvinist ideas going on for Jews at the same time. For example, the Muskel-Jew, the muscle Jew, were kind of like elements of this. And then, of course, some elements also influenced early Zionism, which is why there were ideas in Nazi Germany which kind of like died out 2-3 years in the making, of creating a sort of like Nazi Zionist united ideological front, where Zionists were kind of living out the shared ideals of, let's say, striving towards civilizational success in Palestine. And that is something which was basically tried to put into the world by Germany's. There were two big newspapers. One was Der Stürmer, which was kind of like for the, let's say, proletarian or lower class people, and there was Der Angriff, which was more of like the high-minded, high-class newspaper for Nazis, and they tried to push this idea of Zionism as something which is like pro-Nazi. And they had for a while they had like the okay from the regime for this, and then as Jewish sentiment flipped into a basically complete hostility, even the idea of, well, they're basically like us but only for their own people, and those are the quote unquote honorable Jews, that kind of faded out, and the Zionist idea of Nazism was laying aside. But the point I'm trying to get to is that these ideas did in part actually spring from Jewish root and became a major factor in the genocide. And that's very important because God always punishes us by the idols we make, right? So if there's something you value beyond God, then God will use that almost always. We can't, of course, say exactly how it functions because we can't like state to him how he has to be. But it is, of course, let's say the most proper way, and or almost always the most proper way for him to use precisely that which is your idol to punish you, because that way you are the most likely to abandon your idol. And that is precisely what happened with Jews. So now most or a large quantity of Jews are completely against identity politics, which is actually something which sort of derives from their own religious influence. And of course, that is why you have so many anti-Zionist Jews, which a lot of people don't know, but there's vast swaths of anti-Zionist Jews precisely because they are anti-identity politics. But then, of course, these people don't really have anything to base their own Jewishness back off on, right? So their Jewish faith dilutes, which is what needs to happen for them to be able to accept Christ and Christianity. Because as soon as the faith becomes something that is not intrinsically linked into their own being, and here again we have this problem of intimation and extimation, right? The faith is intimated into these people as something that is part of their blood, right? So basically, when you are the most intimate, you are also perpetuating Jewishness, which is basically what a blood religion is. That way, or through this punishment, it can now be extimated. And extimating this faith means that people are cultural Jews or intellectual Jews, or they still listen to their rabbi and they still go to, I don't know, Jewish summer camp, but they do not see this as something which is necessarily drawn to their blood. And that means that these people can now are now able to actually, for the first time in a very long time, engage with their faith in such a capacity where, let's say, a damage to it or its identity wouldn't reflect a damage in their own identity, right? So that is basically afforded through the
Yeah.
through also the shedding of blood. Okay, so we have a faith that opens itself through the act of an egregore, right? The egregore is prepared. The entity, the social living entity, the social spirit, basically, is prepared to produce the Messiah, then cannibalizes him, then thereby can be saved into serving him or being transcended by him, because Christ becomes for it the individual which uplifts it, which is why, again, all Christians are actually there at the cross, because we all partake in this egregore which cannibalized Christ, right? And if we accept that, we sort of like go through his action of transcending this cannibalization, become part of his body, because he masters this egregore, and then through its functionality, we basically, again, and that is why it kind of works like the immune system, it's something that works in tandem with his body, because it helps us introduce itself into his body, because an egregore is always something which is in tandem with the psyche of its members, which I hopefully have explained sufficiently at this point. But there's an offshoot, an offspring of it, right, which is the egregore which takes him as a sacrificial lamb, right, which kills him, but doesn't accept this as the method of its own salvation, right? And that is the other egregore, and they cannot accept the blood on his hands. And so now we get into the final motif of blood, and hopefully that explains, or that kind of like rounds it all out. Because of course we know what blood is through Pasha, we know it through the rites, the Mosaic rites, and so on and so forth. Blood is used to sanctify the temple and cleanse it from sin, right? You take the blood of a goat, you cleanse the temple with it. That's part of Jewish rite, and of course we do this ritually as Christians every time we partake in Mass, because we have the transubstantiation of the blood and of the body of Christ. So we have the sacrificial lamb. So the blood is spilled, and thereby the blood sanctifies the temple which it is in, right? And it's not spilled around the temple, because the temple which it actually properly sanctifies is the priest, and the priest is taking over the, let's say, the full being of the people which are below him, right? So we could receive the blood also as members, but it is enough if we just receive the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is the fullness of Christ. And for the, let's say, the ritual part of the blood working, it is sufficient if just the priest takes it. And I might skip that topic, but anyways,
Yeah, skipping sounds good.
yeah, I'm just skipping because I also wanted to talk about
what's on the block. I mean, you wanted to talk about. We talked
I
about
also
deicide in
wanted to talk,
general.
yeah. We talked about
We talked about
deicide,
Jews and
talked about
pagans.
Jews, pagans, human sacrifice, and then I also want to talk about the surrendering of agency in a higher entity. Now we're just finishing out on the necessity of blood to sanctify someone, because the other ritual important thing with blood is that even though it cleanses the temple, it is at the same time impure. So one of the, let's say, quick ways for a Jewish man back in the day to say why are men situated hierarchically above women is because women bleed regularly, which is an impurity. So women are more impure than men. Bleeding always is an impurity, right? So how come that something which is normally impure, blood, is used to purify the temple? Okay. And again, this is a sort of like uh, a ritual, or this is a ritual need, right? The impurity needs to intimate itself with the other impurity and thereby sort of um, cancel one another out, right? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's minus and minus.
Yeah, it's like minus and minus, or it's like, having two enemies fight one another, stuff like that, right? And
Yeah.
thereby basically the purity can remain. So in taking the blood on your own hands, you are soiled in impurity, and you need to render your own impurity upon this in order to accept this, right? In order to uh, be um, to be delivered, basically. And so if you do not do that, you're actually doubly impure. And that is why it is worse for a Jew and even worse for a Christian to be in deicide without accepting this and seeking redemption, right? Because you basically have twice the impurity, because you have the blood on your hand and you have the blood within yourself, and you need to render those upon one another to
Yeah.
basically free yourself from them, right? Um, okay, that is the reason. Right? It's very mystically important, right, for us and for the salvation of who are our elder brothers, for them to realize that they are the killers of God, right?
Yeah.
And all of what that means, right? Because as we also see, those who do not know God, right, those who are, let's say, dialectically attempting to pursue him through extermination, the pagans, right? They actually need to go through a sort of instance of continuous slaying of God, right? In order to individuate into such a form where they're able to receive divinity properly, right? And that is why, because you can't be expected to slay every other god and then stop at God, he is okay with being pierced by those who do not know any better, which again is
Yes.
Longinus, and then those who do know better, but in a sort of like um, desiring and confirming and doubting way, which is Thomas, right? And then those who do know better and who do not have that form of doubt, when they fall into extimating God, they basically have this or go through this yeah, this twin action, right, of being soiled internally and externally through what you did and what this did to your soul. And by the way, you're only forgiven fully and, let's say, unconditionally from that which you did inside of your soul, which uh which goes to your salvation. So of course you're forgiven, but not, which is another way to say that you're forgiven but not free from consequences. So having blood on your hand is still something you need to also wash off physically, which means that, for example, if you steal someone's purse, you go to confession, the priest will also say it, but let's say he's, I don't know, he's busy. He's just like, okay, you're forgiven. You still need to return the purse, right?
Yeah.
It's that. So for example, I sometimes confess that I sleaze off at work, and then my priest always tells me, okay, you sleazed off for half an hour. now do something to give that half an hour back. And so, for example, then I kind of like log out of work half an hour early, and then I do an extra half an hour to kind of like repay that debt which I have incurred, right? Which is kind of like separate from the sin I have put upon myself of basically more or less lying to my employer. Okay. Sadly, no questions in chat. This is a topic which is
Was
very
there even
difficult.
anyone in the chat?
There were some people watching. One person who even wrote something into the chat. So thank you for that, Panper. Price is risen. God bless. But this is a very complicated topic. So if people watch this afterwards, I'm very happy to take questions. This was a very brief rundown. I even didn't get to go to one part, which is just, well, it's something the libertarians kind of got me into. It's just that when the social hierarchy forms itself, an aspect of it is that we necessarily render agency onto people who are higher in the social hierarchy. So people who are higher in the social hierarchy basically act in the name of people who are lower in it. And that is why the rabbis, which are invested by the people below them, not through election, because election isn't the only way through which people invest agency in people who are higher in authority, but in this case, simply through the acceptance of the society, are able to act for the whole corpus of the Jewish people. So basically, the way to opt out is the way to opt out of being Jewish, which is to be Christian, right?
Yeah.
And because some people have raised that, is that, well, why are these seemingly arbitrary people the representatives? And the reason is just because in the way in which this society organizes itself and still organizes itself to this day, in the way in which the egregore kind of, let's say, shuffles on, basically, the agency is in part relegated to what is basically the teachers, the rabbis, however you want to call them. And they are the one who in Congress with one another as a large majority of one another make the decision to have Christ martyred, which they thereby make on the behalf of all the people who participate in the system which gives them the authority which they have. So to be part of that system is to be complicit in the act which it has chosen, and thereby to kind of take on the responsibility of killing Christ. And this is also something which is maybe important, is that this is something which then, let's say, mimetically or informationally perpetuates itself. So basically, you have a religion which is based upon the intellectual errors which lead in us Christians to apostatizing from God, right? So the way in which the Pharisees treat religion is always, of course, the mirror to the way in which we may treat religion if we treat it incorrectly. And which is, of course, what we call it Pharisaically. And that way is more or less instituted in what then, let's say, becomes the Jewish faith, which is why there is no sense of practical ecumenism between the faiths, right? There is, of course, and this is also important, there's, of course, a sense of having a shared history and having a shared corpus of experiences to look upon. And there's a lot of practices which are better maintained, let's say, in an archaeological sense in a Jewish community than they are in a Christian community. And it's very beneficial for a Christian to examine also contemporary Judaism from a Christian perspective, with the knowledge that, again, the Pharisaical errors, which we know about in the Bible, have been ingrained into this religion and have taken their toll on it. So if you don't know what I mean by taking their toll, read up, for example, on Sabbatai Zevi. This was a man who was followed by half of, or what we estimated to be half of the entire Jewish community at his time. And he led into complete apostasy, complete carnalization, complete everyone is just sleeping around and having a massive party, basically a massive orgy. To understand how this ultimately still comes from the same metaphysical assumptions of early Christianity, but with a different approach to the relation to God in this metaphysical framework. Okay, it's late. I'm tired. You're tired. I hope this was useful to people. I hope I kind of got through the points I wanted to get through.
This was very enjoyable, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot. If people have questions, just put them into the comments afterwards. There's a lot of very deep topics, and there, of course, again, because Judaism isn't properly estimated, because people don't treat it the same way as we nowadays, for example, treat communism, right? Where people still make communism their identity, but much less, right? For a lot of people, that is an attack on either their own identity or a perceived attack on the being of another. So I know that this is something which may ruffle some feathers, which is okay, right? This is also part of extremation, also part of being Christian, willing to do that. And yeah, I hope this was useful. I hope this gave an insight into many things. A lot of these things I will cover in the channel later when I get to them. But again, the entropy video is 4 hours at this point. A lot of what we talked about today will be in it, but especially kind of like the way in which social structures revive themselves. But yeah, I think I will cut it off here. Say thank you everyone for who kind of tuned in, and say good night. Bye bye.
Bye bye.